before the theory of gravity was a glimmer in Newton's imagination, the natural physics of density and buoyancy already perfectly explained why apples fall down. Quite simply, objects fall or rise based on their relative density to the medium surrounding them. Apples fall because they are denser than the air, while helium balloons rise because they are lighter. No gravity necessary. Everything seeks its relative density and rises or falls until settling accordingly. Now, this has absolutely nothing to do with gravity. Gravity is a hypothetical magnetic-like force to help explain the heliocentric theory of the universe. To claim the existence of a physical law without a single practical evidential example is hearsay, not science. How is it that gravity is so strong that it can hold all the oceans and people stuck to the underside of the ball Earth, but so weak that it allows birds, bugs, and balloons to casually evade its downward pulling force? How is it that gravity holds our bodies clumped to the underside of the ball Earth, but yet we can easily walk or jump and feel no such constant downward pulling force? Gravity, both metaphorically and quite literally, just does not hold any water. Not as a sound theory of cosmology, and not as a law supposedly responsible for holding in the world's oceans.
Gravity is an unproven theory made into an assumption and treated as a fact. The entirety of astrophysics begins with the assumption that gravity exists, then continues forward. It is in complete violation of sound scientific reasoning to bypass necessary verification of some aspect of science and regard it as fact. If we were to allow this violation of the necessity of proof required for gravity, science would immediately lose all its foundation of validity because anything goes at that point. We can all acknowledge the fact that sometimes when we do our laundry, a sock comes up missing and is nowhere to be found. We don't have a sound explanation for this, so maybe we invent one. Gnomes. Let's now declare that because socks go missing, and we don't know why, that it is necessary enough proof that it must be gnomes taking our socks. Thenceforth, it becomes acceptable to claim it a fact that whenever a sock is missing from your load of laundry, that it was taken by gnomes, seeing that they're now real even though we have never detected or seen said gnomes. Now the purpose of this text is to introduce you to alternative, valid reasons for why things fall, float, and rise, using only concepts that have been or can be observed or verified, centering around the concepts of relative density, and nowhere in this definition is there need or room for some ad hoc force called gravity. The example with the gnomes and missing socks sounds ridiculous, and is meant to, but this example follows strictly the guidelines set upon us if we allow non-proven assumptions to lead our physical sciences. To relate that back to gravity, one has to realize the same steps were followed in defining gravity. An apple drops, and Sir Isaac Newton didn't know why, and couldn't rationally explain why with the current verifiable scientific information, so he made up a force called gnomes. Gravity. Up until this current day, gravity has never been detected, proven, observed, or even consistently mechanically defined. Since its conception, the theory of gravity has been described in three distinct ways. First by Newton as an inherent property of all matter, making all matter attracted to all other matter. Then later by Einstein as the curvature of space-time, and then finally by quantum theorists as a result of hypothesized subatomic particles called gravitons. If gravity was actually an inherent property of all matter, just imagine if that were the case. Do you think if you threw a handful of marbles in space, that all the marbles would start orbiting each other and stick to one another? Do you think they would then begin orbiting around and sticking to you, the relatively much more massive object? So everything you throw out into space would eventually just come back like a boomerang? Really? Scientism apologists will say that gravity is too weak between objects of human-sized proportions to exhibit any noticeable attraction to one another. But if that's the case, then how were the initial molecules attracted to one another that then later formed the Earth? If there is no observable attraction between a baseball and a tennis ball, then what causes the original hydrogen and helium atoms to attract one another? Let's consider the second theory that gravity is actually a bend in space-time. This term, space-time, which Einstein created, claims that points in space are now defined as events, and time is now a fourth physical dimension existing alongside length, breadth, and thickness. As Einstein critic Gerard Hickson wrote in his book Kings Dethroned, while claiming time as a fourth dimension, Einstein explains that by dimension we must understand merely one of four independent quantities which locate an event in space. This is to imply that the other three dimensions which are in common use are independent quantities, which is not the case, for length, breadth, and thickness are essentially found in combination. They coexist in each and every physical thing, so that they are related. Hence, they are not independent quantities. On the contrary, time is an independent quantity. It is independent of any one or all the three proportions of material things. It is not in any way related, and therefore cannot be used as a fourth dimension. The third and latest definition of gravity comes from quantum theorists, who have created hypothesized subatomic particles that no one has ever seen called gravitons. In other words, they're passing it off onto the only field of science, quantum theory, where it is explicitly claimed that anything is possible, and which translates over to, we are now free to postulate anything we want beyond any logical structured field of science, and the guidelines that normally negate incorrect ideas about the universe are now lifted, making us exempt from scrutiny and rebuttal. Seriously, how do you already have a name for something you haven't even found yet? In short, gravity is simply nowhere to be found, and they're just trying to push its existence beyond the scope of any field of science, so we never arrive at the answer. And they do this because there is no answer, and as science progresses, it is forming concrete, demonstrative proof that gravity does not exist in the realms in which they claim it does, so therefore they have to push it just beyond our grasp every time we get close. That's the nature of their so-called proofs for gravity. They conceptualize it, name it, define physics around it, and then leave out the crucial step of discovering it. This is not science. It is science fiction. Discovery and demonstration in science are the most crucial factors, not ones that can be skipped or held off until a further time. Now I know what your smartass is saying. Yeah, it's been detected. Watch this pen drop. But in order for that to be factual, you have to prove against all other rationale the reason that pen drops is uniquely the act of gravity and nothing else. To make matters even worse on you, by definition of gravity, you have to prove how all matter attracts all other matter indefinitely, and how that concept is why the pen is falling towards the ground. Imagine an empty plastic balloon dropping to the ground because gravity pulled it. Now, let's add mass to that empty plastic balloon, thus increasing the force of gravity. But this mass we add is gaseous, helium. Now let's release this once dropping balloon. With the added mass, it won't fall at all and will rise upwards instead. It is supposedly a fact of gravity that two objects of appropriate mass will orbit each other based solely on their relative mass to one another. Unless you require an actual demonstration, an empirical scientific experiment showing it, in which case it has never been done. And the questions continue. How or why would huge solid planets orbit around a giant flaming ball of gas? What is orbit, and why is it never observed, but is the reason why the Earth goes around the Sun? And the Moon around the Earth, but nothing on any smaller scale ever orbits. Why would water stick to the outside of a convex surface? How do we stick to the outside of a ball that's spinning and orbiting 32 times faster than a bullet? How does an object spin forever without ever succumbing to friction? How does the Earth propel itself to remain in constant motion around the Sun without any fuel or burning any energy to sustain such immense velocities? How does the Moon go around the Earth with no energy required at such a grueling pace? How does any of this take place without any form of energy consumption to maintain these outlandish motions and velocities? All of these questions present problems that the theory of gravity simply cannot explain. Can you see how many facts of physics gravity just brushes by the wayside? But we do believe that we have an explanation. You know how beyond 10 miles out to sea, the laws of the land no longer apply, because you are no longer in any national jurisdiction? Well, that is 10 miles horizontally. What most people don't know is that if you travel 10 miles vertically, you're no longer subject to the laws of physics, because you're no longer in any academic jurisdiction.